You've been married for quite a while, got a bunch of kids doing faith in style. They'll tell you that you're awesome and you're not alone. So let's start the show. Who knew Catholics could be so much fun? Greg and Jennifer and how faith is done. Screwing up and trying and forgiving. Adventures in imperfect living. Adventures in imperfect living.
Hey, greetings, folks. Welcome to another broadcast of The Catholics Next Door. No, not The Catholics Next Door. That was the old show. I don't even know what just happened right then. I just went back into a time loop of 10 years ago. That was weird.
You went to radio.
Imperfect Living.
Wow.
Adventures in Imperfect Living. It just said it in the theme song.
I mean, we are
I
The
don't know what's wrong with
Catholics
me.
Next Door.
Nah, let's see. I'm not going to. By the way, I want to rename the show again.
No,
Kidding.
no, you don't.
Kidding. Welcome to the program. My name is Greg Willits from RosaryArmy.com.
And I'm Jennifer Willits, his wife.
I do wish that we had never changed the name away from Rosary Army, but then we just did.
That's okay. You're going to have to live with that for the rest of your life.
Because now it's like Rosary Army presents
That's
Adventures
fine.
in
It
Imperfect
can
Living
present.
with Greg and Jennifer Willits upstairs in the studio at our house. And I'm just going to keep adding words to everything that we're
You're
doing.
the king of prepositional phrases.
Yes. I'm the preposition king. I don't know. There's something about that. Thank you for being here, though. Sincerely, we've been so blessed. I've been saying this so many times of the guests that have been joining us on the program lately, and we've heard from many of you. By the way, we are going to do a one-on-one show coming up very soon of where we catch up and just personal stuff. And
I'll interview you, and you can interview me.
and say what's going on. And
How are you?
So how's your hair? What's going on with school? And then you'll go, how's your lack of hair? And how's your, whatever you're doing up here in the studio. But today we got a great guest for you. And we definitely talk about the book, but we talk about so many other things. And I greatly enjoy having conversations that push me. I don't know if you saw that, but that was pretty impressive. If you're watching right now,
I was going to ignore that
my
happens.
headphones started to slip off, and without even looking, I caught it in my hand before it knocked off cameras and everything else. I love being challenged. And at the same time, it's kind of embarrassing when you're on camera and you're worried about, it's like, this person's so much smarter than me, but I'm going to allow myself to look like a dummy. But I just love learning from people like our guest today, Dr. Dr Kwasniewski, who joins us on the program. This is the second time on the show. He's a Thomistic theologian, so he knows all about St. Thomas Aquinas. He is a liturgical scholar. He knows about the high mass and choral composing and music and so many other things. But what we talk about today is the culmination of many writings that have come together in this new book of his. It's called Treasuring the Goods of Marriage in a Throwaway Society. And if you've been listening to our programs of any length of time, you know how important vocation is to us and how much time we've spent over the years talking about not just the sacrament of holy matrimony and the marriage of one man and one woman and the good that comes from that union in the form of children and helping us to grow in holiness, but also vocations across the spectrum. All these things he tackles in here, particularly in light of our society that doesn't, for whatever reason, want marriage to thrive, despite the fact that marriage is the foundation of our society, that without husbands and wives marrying and procreating and bringing forth children, societies will crumble and fall. And truly, Catholic families are the backbone of society. They are the foundation of all that we do, and that will continue to be the case no matter how much the Throwaway Society wants to bring that marriage down.
So if you love history, philosophy, marriage, sacraments, the Catholic Church, you are in for a treat with our interview with Dr. Dr Kwasniewski.
Peter, you have one of the most impressive bookshelves of any of our guests. And as soon as we connected just now, Jennifer and I are immediately trying to see which ones we can identify. We were looking at your top right. We saw a Michael O'Brien book right out of the gate. And I'm kind of, I shouldn't be proud, but the fact that I recognize that cover, and it's just because it stared at me for so long before I actually attempted to read it. That's why I recognized it. But you're a very prolific writer. Are you a very voracious reader as well?
Yes, I love reading. It's probably the recreational activity I enjoy the most, or leisure activity. Leisure is a better word for it, really. I don't get to read as much as I would like, especially in the area of literature. You mentioned Michael O'Brien. Theophilus that's the book up there on the shelf. I love Theophilus. It's very different from Michael O'Brien's other works. It's shorter. It's historical fiction rather than fiction. But for example, I would love to reread The Brothers Karamazov by Dostoevsky, and I just don't know when I'm going to get to that. or Dante's Divine Comedy. I've got that on my shelf, looking at me too. So anyway,
I've never read the Divine Comedy, but for The Brothers Karamazov, that was one of those that I had to read it on a Kindle, and it was whenever I was walking through a parking lot. It's just like, I got to read a page. I've been just trying to get a page done because it was one of those, I could never find the time to just sit and read it, and just had to work through it in every spare second. And the Kindle was the only way I could make my way through that one.
Well, besides all the reading and the writing, I'm just kind of curious, do you ever find time for watching any kind of film or movie? How do you enjoy other holy recreation?
Yes. Well, I don't, to be honest, I'm not a big movie person. I know some people for that, they really get into films and they know all about the actors and all the different films. I'm not that way, but my wife and I do enjoy watching, I would say, maybe one movie a month. That's probably what we do. And they tend to be classics, either older black and white films, Hitchcock films. We like Miyazaki's animated films with Studio Ghibli. So there are some. What was the one we just watched a documentary the other evening about cats in Istanbul, of all things.
I might want to see that one.
That's a very niche movie that you watched the other day. not just about cats, not just about Istanbul, but cats in Istanbul. I had to.
That's right.
Well, you already answered 2 questions for me that I haven't even asked yet. I wanted to know, are you married and do you have kids? Because we're having you on the show to talk about this wonderful book about marriage, and I couldn't easily discern if you were, in fact, a married man and a dad.
Yes. Well, I hope that the book doesn't read like the ponderings of somebody who doesn't know what he's talking about. But it is in fact true that I've been married for almost 25 years. Our 25th anniversary is coming up this December 27th.
Nice.
Oh, that's awesome.
And it's funny that the bio in here says, I've written X number of books, and people probably want to know, how many kids do you have? That's the more relevant bit of information. So we have a son and a daughter. We were definitely open to having a larger family, but that wasn't in God's providence for us. But we're very, very happy with the son and daughter that we have. They are right now almost 24 and almost 21. So
you're
fun ages.
Yeah, it's an interesting age because your relationship shifts around that time, and you start to they become really who they're going to be for a good long time. Whereas for those first 20 years, it's like, I don't know what you're going to be next week, and so figuring that out.
Yeah, it is. It's a challenging but also very fulfilling time because with both of our children. And I hope that they wouldn't be embarrassed if they heard me saying this, but I think that we've shifted towards more like an adult friendship. There's a growing equality that takes place as they become who they are, and they know their own mind, or at least they know more of their own mind than they certainly ever did before. And they've now made their circle of friends, and they've kind of launched out and to a certain extent into the world. They're not living at home anymore. And so you have to recalibrate and readjust your relationship. And parents, I think, go through the realization that I can't really flex my parental muscles that much anymore. I have to work by way of persuasion, by way of friendly suggestion. You might want to think about this, or
Exactly.
When I was your age, I did this and I regretted it, or something like that. So it's interesting. It really is. And it's also kind of harrowing because you watch, every child who's born into the world is going to become a free, independent human being, and they're going to make their own good and bad decisions. And you just can't not only can't you prevent that, but you shouldn't even want to prevent that. You just have to pray a lot
Yeah.
that it goes well. So.
Well, and that's kind of, I mean, we're jumping ahead a little bit and talking about the book, but you talked about having children in this, and the idea of, like, even chapter 3, for lust or love of children, and the idea of having large families. And another book that has been out right now is the Habsburg Way, and we're going to have the Archduke of Habsburg on the program as well, talking about one of the things he says, one of the 7 rules of life, or however he lists it, is have large Catholic families, and the way that it's not about just having babies for the sake of having babies. Talk about why it's so important for families today, in particular, to be open to that life, and as you said, however few or as many children that God gives us, because we all also know many couples that want to have large families and can't even conceive right now, and so there's a lot in there that mixes up with marriage.
Yes, yeah. To me, in fact, almost nothing is more tragic than. Well, I mean, the worst thing of all is abortion. But then when you think about people who are longing to have children and they can't have the children, and it's a moment where you really have to fall on your knees before God and just say, I trust you that you know what you're doing, because I can't make any sense out of this. Those who have a heart for life can't, fulfill that desire. So that's a big cross, a big burden. And I think actually looking at infertile couples is almost a window into the answer to your question, because couples who want to have children and can't, they have to wrestle or fight against this almost like a sense of pointlessness. Like, I mean, obviously we're happy to be together, I mean, we were meant to be together and we said yes to each other for life and till death do us part. But there's a natural sense that God himself planted in us that marriage is supposed to bear fruit, that it's supposed to go beyond the husband and wife. Their love is not self-enclosed. It's not sort of narrowly, focused on each other in some kind of solipsistic way, but it's really meant to break open and to grow and expand, so that love becomes more and more love and life. The more life there is, the more love there can be, right? And so it's frustrating when that doesn't happen, right? And how often is it the case that, at least I'm told this frequently, that older women will look at larger families and say, oh, we should have had more children. Now, I mean, of course, that's not always their reaction. Sometimes their reaction is, I can't believe you've had so many children, don't you know what, birth control is or something. But I mean, so you can have different kinds of reactions, but definitely I think some women, when they're honest with themselves, realize that they were sold a lie, with feminism and with, you should put your career and yourself first and not your husband and your family first and your children. I think that they realized they were sold, a false package of goods there.
Yeah.
Well, now that you are experiencing life without children in the home, how are you experiencing a fruitful marriage when the children are not there?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, there are maybe 2 or 3 different ways I could answer that question. One is that, as my wife and I grew older in our marriage, I should just say, at the very beginning of our marriage, we thought that maybe we should become Dominican tertiaries. We thought, well, we both love intellectual things, and Dominicans are very intellectual. And so we kind of looked into that for a little while and realized it wasn't for us. But many years later, what hit us over the head is that we are basically Benedictines, right? We are people who love the liturgy. We love to pray the breviary, the divine office. We love to follow the liturgical year and to kind of put ourselves into the spirit of each season and each feast day. And so we became Benedictine oblates, although we're oblates of different monasteries. So kind of like a mixed marriage in a certain way. So she's an oblate of a monastery in Ireland. I'm an oblate of a monastery in Italy. They're both, very traditional monasteries, and we've gotten to visit them a number of times. These monasteries, obviously, we know people there very well. So one of the ways we've tried to be fruitful as we've had more time is just to give more of our time to the Lord in prayer, and to know, as the Church assures us, that that is actually a deeply fruitful way to spend your time. That you don't have to be always doing something or always sort of making a difference in the world. You need to ask God to make a difference in the world, right? Because he says, ask me, in that famous part of the gospel where he says, the harvest is abundant and the laborers are few. What does he say? He doesn't say, therefore, go out into the harvest. He says, pray the Lord of the harvest to send more workers into the vineyard. The first thing we're supposed to do when we see a need is to pray, right? And so that's one way. The other way has just been, that we try to be intellectually fruitful. God has given us both a lot of ability and interest in regards to studying and teaching the faith. I do that in a more public way through my articles and books and so forth, lectures, but she also does it. She's a translator and she translates a number of books from French. She's very humble about it, and she often goes anonymously. And she'd probably kill me if she knew I was telling you this, but she's very, very private about it. But the point is that we both use our time. We try to use our time for the Lord and for the church.
Beautiful.
Well, as a complete aside, and this is probably one of those areas where I'm going to be lacking prudence in bringing it up in the middle of a conversation that will be public versus waiting until the end of this. But one of the initiatives that we've been working on through our Rosary Army ministry was we're getting ready to launch something called School of Mary, which is based on a lot of the writings of St. Louis Marie de Montfort. And one of the things that I personally am struggling with is how do I get translations of some of his writings, and so I might be reaching out to you for your.
But I thought his writings were already translated. Isn't there a volume called God Alone?
Yeah, and but some of it is the copyright, and then there's also there's some discrepancies in some of the volumes that you'll look at. You'll see different ways that it's translated, and so trying to find maybe with updated scholarly research and translations of those things, I'm thinking that it's time for an updated translation is basically what I'm starting to wonder about that, and I'm not nearly of the scholarly level to be able to make that determination. But the fact that I see some red flags myself just with some of his prayers and various translations, that I start to wonder if it's time to maybe revisit that. So anyway. Sure. That's just a complete and total aside, but again, we've had so many providential conversations lately with people like you that God keeps having things come out of people's mouths that makes us go, "Oh my goodness gracious!" That's almost sound like an answer to a prayer for a second. But let's go back to your writing process. I'm so fascinated. You are one of the most prolific Catholic writers out there right now, and I think I said this to you when you were on the program before. I'm startled, a little bit jealous at the level or the amount that you're able to write. And I was really paying attention in this one of, and where some of your writings are coming from. And I'm always so curious about the process. And now you're writing several books a year, and you launched a Substack. So now you're doing this new weekly commitment. Do you have any idea how many words a day you write? Do you have a goal? Do you have a process for trying to get this all this stuff done?
No, I don't really have a process. I know that there are writers out there who are very, they wake up at 6 a.m. and they have a cup of coffee and they write for 3 hours. And then, I don't have anything that organized. But I do tend to work in great big gushes or spurts. So, I'll get an idea and I'll sit down and I'll just work the whole day on that, whatever that is. And then I might not write something for the next 2 days after that. So I don't want to attribute it to inspiration, because that sounds too, self glorifying or something. But I mean, there is something to the idea of inspiration. I mean, I have to be seized by an idea. It has to matter to me. And oftentimes, I mean, sadly enough, that inspiration often comes from reading something about church news, like so-and-so, this cardinal said such and such. What? and then immediately I start writing, that's impossible, and here's all the reasons why, and here's what John Paul II said, and here's what St. Thomas Aquinas said, and so on and so forth. And so I think that having a stimulus in that way is extremely helpful. I don't like sitting down to a blank screen and starting from scratch. And the other thing I should mention, and I might have mentioned this to you before, I don't remember, but I'm a sort of what's the word I want? Irrepressible note taker. I write notes all the time. In fact, it's a joke in my family. I have Post-it notes all over the place, scraps of paper.
Oh no, I can't. Hold
And
on. You said Post-it notes.
Yes,
That's like the bane of his existence. I love them
Oh, yeah.
personally. I think they're awesome. But go ahead.
And I'll even say, I mean, I hope that this doesn't get me in trouble with anybody either. But sometimes I'm sitting at Mass. So I sing in the choir at my local Fraternity of St. Peter Parish. And so I'm there every Sunday morning. It's a very long solemn Mass. I love it. I love every bit of it. But there have been times during the homily when I've got my bulletin there and suddenly an idea occurs to me. It might actually be prompted by the homily. And I just start scribbling on the, so everybody in the choir knows, oh, Dr. K is scribbling something on. So I've got actually on my desk, I wasn't planning this, but I have examples of some of these bulletins. Like here's
awesome.
Here's a bulletin that you can see.
I love
That's
it.
very similar to what happens with
Yeah,
us. You have to go to Mass with a pencil and some paper to write on.
Yeah.
I believe that.
That is awesome.
So anyway, I mean, I don't know if any of these notes will ever actually become something, but I'm an inveterate note taker. And so over the years, then I sit down sometimes and I type these notes into my computer and I try to give the file a really clear title. And then I stick it in a huge folder that's called drafts. And this folder now has probably well over 1,000 documents in it. But just by using the search function, I can search for something like frequent communion. And it'll bring up 6 little notes where I've written stuff to myself about frequent communion. Or if I read something in a book, I copy it down and I put it in there. So basically, it's a strange process because it's like making a mosaic with all these little pieces that eventually become something. But it seems to work, so I guess I'll stick with it.
Well, many of the writings in this new book, Treasuring the Goods of Marriage in a Throwaway Society, were published in various forms in other outlets, websites and magazines and such. Do you plan, and it kind of sounds like maybe not, but do you plan from the beginning when you start writing articles that maybe that these are all going to come together at some point into a cohesive book? Do you create an outline of the articles that you want to write and start making those available one at a time and then pull them together later on? Or is there a process there for compiling everything into a book? No.
No, I've never actually done what you just described. Instead, I find that I gravitate towards maybe a dozen topics that come up over and over again, whether it's a liturgical topic or sacred music or marriage and family and pro-life issues. So these things keep coming up and I keep writing about them. And after a number of years, I look back over what I've written and I say, you know what, that's a substantial amount of work. And it's all obviously thematically related. So can I sit down with these things and can I organize them in a way that would actually make some kind of whole?
Yeah.
So it's true that, that my books, and I don't know, some people, nobody has ever really criticized me for this. It's just an observation that they've made that my books really are collections of essays. I mean, that's kind of the genre that I work in. It's not a sort of treatise from start to finish where you're going systematically from one thing to the next. I do have a couple of books like that, but I mean, typically my books are drawn from a wide variety of sources.
Our dear friends, Mac and Catherine, and so I want to give them credit for it. They on their podcast, Catholic in a Small Town, they're constantly talking about John Sr. and that's what your books have started to remind me of, is because he would do those collections of essays and then they would pull them together into either the death of Christian culture, the restoration of Christian culture.
Yes.
There were themes, but you could also tell that each of the chapters were really standalone essays that all come together. And again, I just thank you for indulging me on because
sure.
But I think it's important to talk about how all this content comes together, and even your experience at your FSSP parish and your own liturgical, I won't call them preferences, but where God is pulling you. You're a part of the schola at your church. You're going to the Latin Mass. And even just since you were on the program last, we were already attending the TLM, but that's something that is now, it is very much embedded. That's pretty much all we attend now. And it's so much has changed in the world in the last 2 years since we spoke last. And the idea that part of your title is Treasuring the Goods of Marriage in a Throwaway Society. Let's talk about maybe finding a way of merging all these things together, of how important liturgy is, and how the family is fed by the liturgy, and how much those things are needed in today's throwaway society. What is it about, and let's just back it up, what is it about today's society that makes it a throwaway society, as you say in your title?
Yes, exactly. Yeah, no, I mean, I think that the fundamental difference between a Christian and a modern Western secularist is that the modern Western secularist either believes some version of the Marxist progressivist myth that that the world is getting better and better through science and technology, and we can become happier and happier that way. I don't know how many people really believe that anymore, because it's almost impossible to believe, but there are some, and it was a popular myth for a long time. Or they're kind of nihilists and hedonists. That is, the only point of being alive is to accumulate stuff, accumulate pleasures. And, if you think too hard about the meaninglessness of it, you'd probably kill yourself. But we'll distract ourselves, in 1,000 different ways. And we won't think about that. We'll just try to live in the moment, almost like a perversion of the, sacrament of the present moment idea, right? Where you're supposed to live in the present moment with divine providence. Well, there's a perverse secular version of that too, which is, don't think about the past, don't think about the future and your final judgment. Just think about the present moment and me. And so that's the secularist. The Christian is somebody who is necessarily embedded in a history, the history of salvation, the history of the church and of our tradition, and where we come from, and how we believe, what we believe, how we express what we believe, especially in worship. And we are also oriented towards the future, towards the second coming of Christ at the end of time, and towards the coming of Christ in our own lives, whether in the moment through the sacraments and prayer, or at the end of our lives when we will meet Christ, right? That's the second coming for each one of us, before the definitive second coming, right? And so in a way, the Christian is living in the moment, but surrounded by the past history, tradition, salvation, history, and by the future, by where he is heading, and the kingdom of God ultimately. And so I think that gives us all the more reason to be rooted, consciously rooted in our past, and consciously thinking about what is the ultimate eternal goal of our life. And that, of course, has huge ramifications for marriage and family. I mean, when people get married, what are they marrying for? They're marrying because of some goods that God wants to give them in the present and for the future, right? The goods of faithfulness, lifelong fidelity, the good of children, of offspring, and the good of the sacrament itself, by which they can embody the relationship between Christ and the church. I mean, we'll all embody it imperfectly, but we're all supposed to model that and image that. And so what an incredible vocation is given to us, but we only know about that because of divine revelation. We only know about that because of tradition, right? Mm-hmm. So the Throwaway Society, unfortunately, has invaded the church too. There are people in the church who want to throw away the moral theology of John Paul II. He wasn't even Pope that long ago, and the Pontifical Academy for Life and the John Paul II Institute in Rome, these places are unrecognizable compared to what they were just a couple of decades ago, right? So
even a decade ago. I mean, the argument could be made of just where it feels like, it feels like our pastor likes to use the phrase dumpster fire a lot, and it just feels like a lot of the teachings. When you think of a dumpster fire, it's all the bad stuff on fire. It's just great. But it feels like all the good stuff, that people are making an effort to throw all the good stuff into the fire.
Yes. Well, I mean, when Martin Luther decided to oppose the Church of Rome, what did he do? He had a bonfire, and he threw the works of church fathers and doctors, including St. Thomas Aquinas, into that bonfire, right? So Luther was acting out, you might say, at that moment, symbolically, his attitude. His attitude was, I don't care what the great tradition says. I don't care that everybody before me has been Catholic. I'm going to do my own thing, right? And so and that's why some people call Luther the first modern. I mean, it's a little bit difficult to say who was the first modern. That's a difficult question, because then you have to define what is modernity, whatever. But the idea of subjectivism, of individualism, of setting yourself up, your own will against the institution, against the people, against the tradition, all of this is definitely there in Luther. And then it takes several centuries to kind of unfold and unwind in all of its forms. So.
Where would you draw that line, Dr. K, where modernity begins and where the past, ended? It's, if we love to live with tradition and we love to look backward, is there a line that we could draw where things were safe and real? Like, I know that the missile says 1962, but now I know there's other missiles that predate that missile. I'm like, well, where's the line? Where is it?
It's a difficult question, because history is like a river that is just flowing along, and the river is carrying lots of things in it. It's got the fish in it, but it's also got some trash in it too. So you can't, there isn't a perfect moment in history. Every century has its crisis. But these crises themselves are bigger and smaller. I mean, it's like a mountain range where you have all different heights and valleys. So, I mean, I think what we can say for sure is that the Catholic Church is in a perpetual state of crisis in history. That's true. But that there are times that are relatively peaceful. That is where you have maybe this problematic heresy over here in this country and this problematic schism over there in that place. But generally speaking, things are going relatively well. And that's true of much of the Middle Ages, actually. I mean, there were lots of chieftains fighting each other all the time, but there was also a cultural and spiritual stability there, and the monasteries were flourishing, and nobody was questioning what gender or sex they were. I mean,
right.
There's a kind of both tradition and sanity,
right,
to use the name of my Substack, right? We're there in spades, So I think we can look back to the Middle Ages and say that was a time when Christendom really had come into fruition, and when things were going probably as well as they will ever go for fallen human beings. Okay. But then you have the Great Western Schism, when you had 2 and up to 3 rival popes with saints on all sides. I mean, talk about chaos. And you had the Black Death, which was one of the most horrific experiences that the human race has ever seen. And then you had the Protestant Revolt. And then not too long after that, a couple of hundred years after 1717, you have the founding of the first Freemasonic Lodge, then the French Revolution, and various revolutions followed thereafter. So, I mean, it's, where you start modernity is a challenging question. I would say that modernity has several crucial ingredients that had to be put in place before you could get the entire recipe. The first was nominalism, which already arose in the 14th century with William of Ockham, right? Nominalism, which says things do not have essences, they don't have natures. We just put labels on things. So there's no such thing as human nature. There are just individual men, and they have enough in common that we can put a label on them that says man. Right. This is a very radical philosophical position, right? Because it denies that there is a whatness, an essence, a nature to a thing, such that you can say, this is good for man, for human nature. This is evil for human nature, right? And famously, William of Ockham said, well, if God had wanted to give us an inverted decalogue, where he commanded us to hate him, to kill each other, to commit adultery, and so on, he could have done that. He was perfectly free to do that. It was arbitrary. He said, I'm going to put out these commandments, but he could have put out the opposite commandments. And so with Occam, there's a real irrationalism that enters into Christianity it enters into Christendom for the first time. Luther was a nominalist. So several hundred years later, Luther, who breaks with the church definitively, is somebody who's been formed by William of Ockham's ideas, right? That's not surprising. That's not surprising at all. And then when you get to somebody like René Descartes, not that long after Luther, you're talking about the one that people often call the father of modern philosophy. If Occam is the grandfather, Descartes is the father. And what does Descartes say? Well, he says a lot of things, but he bifurcates man into mind and body, right? He's a dualist. So he thinks that our mind and our body have they have nothing to do with each other. They just happen to be, coinciding. They're sort of connected, he says, at the pituitary gland, which is absurd. And so he introduces this dualism, and that's what makes possible something like transgenderism, because I am not my body. I, the ego, the consciousness, I can do whatever I want. I can be whatever I want, as long as I have the technology to manipulate my body, which is treated like my property, right? So Descartes was absolutely essential for this, for the moves that we're seeing right now. What's so remarkable to me, and I'll stop here because I could go on forever about this, but what's so remarkable to me is just errors will arise in history, and they don't actually bear all of their rotten fruits until much later.
In the case of what you're talking about, we're looking at hundreds of years later.
Yeah,
we're seeing
exactly.
the fruit.
It can take hundreds of years. Why is that? Well, I mean, I think one reason is that when an error is first propounded, like Descartes' dualism, most even intellectuals are not convinced of it. There were some Cartesians, but there were many others who were opposing him. And most common people would say that's absurd. Like if you had told a peasant in the year 1600, here's what René Descartes is saying, he would have looked at you as if you had three heads. What are you talking about? That makes no sense. So errors take a long time to penetrate into people's heads. And how does that happen? Well, it happens when more and more intellectuals start espousing the errors. Then they are teaching in universities. They form the next generation of students, or they start advertising it. A lot of modern advertising, and this has been true for a long time, it contains philosophical errors in it. But of course, they're not spoken as such. They're just given a beautiful, glamorous appearance in the form of an ad. And the ad then is what populates somebody's imagination. So people are Cartesians without even realizing it.
Yep.
In Tocqueville, the great political philosopher Tocqueville, all the way back in the 19th century, he said Americans are Cartesians without realizing it. So it's amazing that he said that.
Wow. So many things that I want to respond to in what you just said. And when you talk about the separation of body and mind, that makes me think of something that you said in the preface of the book. So the book is called Treasuring the Goods of Marriage in a Throwaway Society. The book doesn't just cover marriage, but truly vocation as a whole. So I want to ask, at one point, what was the core thing that you're wanting to accomplish in the book, which I think is what we're already getting there and talking about it, because in the preface, right from the outset, you are referring to the human body as a liturgical vessel and an instrument of divine worship. Is that where you're trying? Is that the core? Is that where you're pulling things, and where the essays are going to be pointing to in that regards? Because there has been this crazy separation of mind and body in today's world. We're seeing the rotten fruit coming to fruition. That idea of a liturgical vessel and instrument of divine worship, that is what the human body is meant to be. Can you talk about a little bit about those things?
Yes. I mean, I wouldn't necessarily say that that's the central motif, but it certainly is a major motif. Yes, I mean, my book is profoundly anti-Cartesian, because what I want to argue, what I do argue, is that man is a unity of body and soul. I mean, that's something we know not just from church teaching, but also from experience, from subjective experience, and from philosophy. I mean, Aristotle thought that and argued that a long time ago, actually against Plato, because Plato was something of a dualist as well. But no, man is a body-soul unity. And what John Paul II added to that, I think very much in continuity with Aristotle and St. Thomas, is that the body expresses who we are. The body is a symbol, in a sense, of myself. It's not my property. It's not to be manipulated by me as a kind of experimental object, but rather it's how I present myself. It's part of my self-presentation. It shows on the outside who I am on the inside. I mean, this is not a perfect correspondence. I mean, we have to use language, for example, to say what our thoughts are. Our body is not going to tell us what our thoughts are. That is, I can't look at your body and know what you're thinking. So we need language, of course. We need these rational tools. But what I mean is something more primal and more basic, that the body shows that we are male or female, first of all. So it shows that we're related towards each other. This is very much what John Paul II was doing in his so-called theology of the body. And so it shows that we're relational beings, that we're meant to be completed in relationship. And this fundamental insight also then illuminates priesthood and religious life too. I mean, that's one of that's the reason they come in here is because marriage and celibacy consecrated to God, these are mutually illuminating. Each one of them is a gift of self through the body, right? That's exactly what we're talking about here. And, Christ our Lord, he gave himself completely up for us on the cross in his body. He allowed his body to be ravaged. It's his ultimate sacrifice of love was a bodily sacrifice. And he gives that bodily sacrifice to us in the Eucharist as well. So that the Catholic faith is almost ridiculously bodily, right? It's we're the only religion in the world, I would say, that takes in the most serious way the unity of the soul and the body, right? Almost every other religion doesn't, it runs away from that or can't deal with that, that scandal of this intellectual creature being not trapped in a body. That's a negative way of putting it, but being united with a body. What a strange paradox that is,
And today, people want to say that they are trapped in the wrong body, that they're
Yes.
and then they lose a sense of. And you talk a lot about nobility in the book and how marriage is a noble thing, and trying to bring back that idea of what's been stolen, particularly I feel like in the last 10 years, of stealing away the idea of marriage being this noble, transcendent at times institution established by God for the sake of the foundation of society, for the propagation of the heavenly population, and trying to build up the world in that way. All these things get mixed up in here, but at the same time, I found it really interesting that you do spend that time, and you just touched on it, the idea of the bodily sacrifice of those who are priests or who are consecrated to a religious vocation, living out chaste lives, both in marriage and in religious vocations and such. But the idea of nobility, it really stuck out to me many times when reading through your book.
Yes, I'll talk about that in just a moment. But to finish this thought about the body, the relationality that we see in our body, right, is not just a sexual one, but it's also the fact that we all have faces, and our faces are the way in which we can recognize one another as persons, in which we can address each other. I see, in a certain sense, I see your personhood in your face. And even the word person comes from the word prosopon, which means mask. That's a whole separate question. But so we are relational beings in regard to, we stand upright and we face each other, and we communicate with each other, whether it's, with the opposite sex or with the same sex. And so when we understand that human beings are essentially relational, it's not just relational to other human beings, but relational to persons, to other intellects. So that's why we are able to be relational to God as well. I mean, in other words, we're the image of God. That image is written all over us, in our bodies and in our souls, although directly in our souls and more indirectly in our bodies. And so what the priest or the religious is saying to himself, to herself, to the whole world is, I am first and foremost in communication with God. He is the one that I'm having a face-to-face relationship with. And that is what all of us are destined for, the face-to-face vision of God, and which is compared in Scripture to a wedding feast, right? And Christ, he remains celibate in order to show that he is the bridegroom of the church and the bridegroom of all of our souls, really. And so that is, he gives himself for the whole human race. The whole human race is the bride that he wants, you could put it that way. And so married people need to learn, we all need to be reminded, let's put it this way, whether we're married or not, that our ultimate marriage is the heavenly marriage. Right? And that's why it's crucial that the church always have and prize these vocations to consecrated celibacy. That's so important because we have here no abiding city. And even in the happiest marriage, and I talk about this too in the book, even in the happiest marriage imaginable or possible, there will still be a sense of we are not perfectly fulfilled. You cannot be perfectly fulfilled by anyone except God, right? And so even the the sort of difficulties of day-to-day life and marriage, and the difficulties of getting older too, which I talk about in one of the chapters. These are meant to provoke us to turn our gaze heavenward and Godward. That's so important. So then this question about nobility, right? I think that nowadays, of course, marriage is trashed. I mean, it's completely, people trash talk it, right?
Yeah.
All the feminists do, the postmodernists, it's an institution, a patriarchal institution of power, and, it enslaves people and whatever. They say all these things which are ridiculous and completely inhuman and anti-human, and lead people to a kind of insanity where they damage themselves as well as other people. And we see that in all the statistics, all the sociology and psychology. We have plenty of data to back up the claim that the Christian view is sane and the modern view is insane. But there's also, I think, a background for Catholics, which is that for a long time, I mean, marriage was always, of course, accepted as the normal way of life for most people. But I think sometimes it wasn't appreciated for its own inherent nobility. That is, it could be seen as a sort of second-rate life, or a sort of like, well, if you're not holy enough to be a priest or religious, then you should get married, right? Because, it's better to marry than to burn, as St. Paul says. All right, so you could, and I've encountered this in talking to people, that people can get really tormented by this thought that, am I just choosing a kind of worldly compromise, by getting married and being sort of immersed in this world, because marriage does necessarily make you think about how you're going to pay the bills and how you're going to buy diapers and how you're going to take, and how you're going to pay for the kids' education, and, all these worldly or secular affairs that occupy you. It's a part of being married. It's very much a this worldly state of life. You have to have your feet on the ground. You can't have your head in the clouds all the time. But I think that can become, for some people, almost, they can interpret that as if it's somehow a bad thing. And I really want to push back against that and say, no. There is a specific divine goodness, a specific sacramental nobility to this state of life that really sanctifies all of those this worldly concerns, as long as we keep putting them, so to speak, on the paten and in the chalice at Mass, right? We have to keep uniting them to the sacrifice of Christ. That is what divinizes them. That is what transfigures them.
And that's what makes them a good. That is what makes us, gives us something that we can treasure, right? We can have a marriage that is completely self-centered and is lustful and is about pleasure, but it really is about allowing marriage to be purgative in many ways, to burn away our worldliness. And that's what I feel like we've found in our own marriage. And we've been very blessed. We've been doing, this kind of thing of talking about marriage and talking about family in podcast form for over 18 years. Well, we've been married going on 28 years. So for more than half of our marriage, Jennifer and I have been blessed to basically work out our marriage very publicly, which has forced us to fight through any difficulties. Well, the difficulties, but also the magnetic attraction of the world that would want to form our marriage in the world's way of looking versus the way that the church has formed us. And so many of the things that you talk about in this, and you talk about contraception, you talk about the evils, particularly of the last, now we're going on 60 years, of ways that the world has been just chipping away at marriage. The duality of the title, right? Treasuring the goods of marriage in a throwaway society. You tackle both of those things. What are some of the goods that you wish people were treasuring more in marriage and in vocation in general?
Yes. I mean, so you actually already touched on two really important ones. Obviously, I spend a lot of time talking about sacrifice, the idea of love as sacrificial. And I push on this. It's not by any means any kind of original idea, but I push on the idea that love is inherently sacrificial. It's not possible to show that you love somebody without giving up something. And that giving up can take all different forms, from small things to great sacrifices, even the sacrifice of one's life, like Jana Beretta Mola, or somebody who gives up her life. I read about this Polish I just recently read about this Polish athlete who was, I think she was diagnosed with cancer while she was pregnant. And she chose, they said, you should abort the child. And she said, no, absolutely, I'm not going to do this. And she gave birth and she died of the cancer. So she gave up her life so that this child could live, because she knew in her conscience, she knew in her heart, you don't kill somebody in order to solve your own problem. I mean, that's absurd, and that's actually where, Pope Francis is right to say it's like hiring the mafia. That doesn't make any sense at all. So sacrifice is inherently a part of love. And this is also why when human beings want to show their love for God, we make a sacrifice to him, right? This is what you see all the way back with Abel, who sacrificed a lamb, with Abraham, who was willing to sacrifice his son Isaac because God told him to. Didn't explain why, just said, basically, I gave him to you, you have to give him back to me. And of course with all the Mosaic law, all of these sacrifices, which were symbolic sacrifices, it's not that God wanted bulls and goats, but he wanted people to give him themselves and to give something valuable to them. That's how we can give ourselves. That's one way we can give ourselves. And then, of course, the supreme sacrifice of our Lord Jesus Christ on the cross. That is the supreme sign, and that is the supreme efficacious sign of love, by which I mean, not only does it show the love that Christ has in his heart for us, but also it empowers us to love him in return, right? He's able to give us the gift of that love so that we can love him in return. So I think, gift of self means sacrificial love, right? And that's true in any state of life. And that's also the way to maturity, and that's the way to joy. That's, joy is different from pleasure. Joy is deeper, it's more abiding, it's less subject to the whims of the world, right? Pleasures come and go, but joy abides. And the other point you brought up was just, one of the basic goods of marriage is what the tradition calls proles, right? Children, offspring. And there's one chapter where, let's see, which one is it? I think it might just be called The Surpassing Gift of Life. But in one chapter I say, look, even the pagan philosophers understood that all living things wanted to reproduce themselves in order to imitate God. This is something you can find in pre-Christian pagan philosophers. Aristotle, Plato, Proclus, Plotinus. Well, Plotinus was post-Christian, but he wasn't a Christian. And what they say is God himself is the infinite good, and his goodness gives rise to the whole of reality. It's all sort of, it's just emerging and erupting from him like a fountain of goodness, right? And any one of us, by nature, wants to imitate God. We should want to imitate God. And in that sense, to be fruitful is just to be natural and normal and godlike, right? And that's something I also hammer on, because modern people have been taught too much to think about having children. Even that expression is kind of an awkward expression, but having children as a choice that they make. No, it's not really a choice. It shouldn't be seen primarily as a choice. It involves choice. Obviously, you have to get married. You have to choose. But it's not primarily a choice. It's primarily a natural result of love. That's how we should see it, and it's a way of imitating God's creativity. Right?
And the idea of children not being something that is a result of love, that's the throwaway society. A good would be to consider them as that gift.
One thing I think is very absent from this conversation, which I find very interesting, is not any one of us right now have even included the pursuit of happiness in this discussion because of how fleeting it is. But I want to know if you can talk about this misguided view that we in our society have, that it's all about the pursuit of personal happiness as a goal, as the end. It's even written into our documents that founded the United States of America. So can you espouse any thoughts on that?
Yeah. Well, the problem with happiness is it's the same problem that you have with the word love itself, which is that the coinage has become debased, right? Love is a noble word, but now it means something cheap and tawdry for a lot of people, in pop songs or whatever. This is an equivocation, right? You have love as in caritas, charity. You have agape. You have love as in philia, friendship, amicizia. You have love as what love for the country, for the patria, for which a soldier gives up his life. I mean, these are totally different from love as lust, right? Which is the typical way in which a lot of people abuse this word. And so similarly with happiness, right? Happiness means nothing other than a state, or really activity, of complete fulfillment, right? Where everything that we are made to be, everything we're meant to be, is fulfilled. That's happiness. That's really happiness. And that is found in the beatific vision, the vision that makes us happy. That's what beatific vision means, literally. And so there's nothing, in a sense, the word happiness, we need to reclaim it for Christianity, right? And say, no, we know what happiness looks like. We've been told what it looks like, and we've tasted it. It's not just pursuing your dream or pursuing you or whatever, right? That's like following the lemmings off the cliff and drowning.
Two things I want to ask you about, and I want to be cognizant of your time, but switching gears a little bit, tell us about your new Substack and what people can get from visiting that. And then also you have another book coming out later on this year from Tan Books, Good Music, Sacred Music, and Silence, 3 Gifts of God for Liturgy and for Life. So what can people be looking forward to with those 2 projects?
Well, yeah, I really appreciate your asking me about the Substack, because I'm hoping to make it really exciting and successful. No, I've been thinking for a while that I needed to have a venue where I could write more freely than I do for the other places that I write for. Not that anybody has ever tried to control what I write or said no, it's not so much about that, but it's more like a sense of like, this is my home base, right? This is where you're going to get Dr. K raw and unfiltered, so to speak. And although I don't usually hold back wherever I'm writing, but anyway, so I don't know. I've been moving towards that for a while. It seemed like the right thing to do. A lot of my friends were encouraging me in that direction as well. So my Substack is called Tradition and Sanity. You can find it very easily by Googling it. And I'm happy to say it hasn't even been a month yet, and I've got over 2,000 subscribers now, which is
Congrats.
good.
That's fantastic.
Yeah, and so far so good, And I do feel, in fact, the Substack I had just yesterday, the post, Living to Die and Dying to Live, which was basically just reflections on death from a Christian point of view. I think it brought out for me some of the most heartfelt writing I've done, on a spiritual theme for a long time. So I think so far so good. That's what I'll say about that.
Excellent.
As far as the book on music is concerned, that is something that I've been thinking about, and the question of music is one of the ones that I'm most passionate about, both sacred music in the church and classical music in general, and the importance of these things for our lives. That book has been in gestation for 30 years, you could say. The things that are in that book are the things that I've thought probably the deepest about for the longest time. Because in fact, my journey into really my life of faith as a Catholic has always been marked by music. I was in a folk choir when I was a kid. I've always, every phase of my life, there's been, church music of a good or bad variety. And it was good church music that first led me to the Reverent Novus Ordo, and then led me to the traditional Latin Mass after that. So I can almost credit music with my sort of liturgical conversion. It's like music was like the one holding the lantern, ahead of me, showing me the way to go. So this is a book that I'm very excited about, and it'll be out next month.
Okay. On the topic of music, I just have to ask, typical evening in the Kwasniewski home, you're deciding what's for dinner, and you realize, I kind of want to hear some music while I'm preparing dinner. What would you do in that moment? Do you yell out to your device and saying, play such and such playlist?
Oh, yeah, no, I don't have any device like that. But no, we have a nice Bose system that has been holding up for a long, long time. Hopefully I don't need to replace it anytime soon. But yeah, we'll put on, we might put on some Mozart, some Bach, Buxtehude, usually not sacred music, because over the years, I've really grown to the point where I want sacred music to be in the liturgy.
Okay.
And sometimes we'll put it on, but what I mean by sacred music, I should be more specific. I mean like Gregorian chant or Palestrina. We will sometimes put that on at home, let's say on Easter Sunday, or, there are certain special days of the year when we might put that on, but I don't like to use it as background music is really what I'm saying. I prefer that if it's going to be music with the Word of God that's meant to be part of worship, let's try to keep that for the liturgy itself. So typically, some kind of, Vivaldi, Telemann. I love Baroque music. Baroque music is just my favorite, period. Yeah. So.
Well, if it's not Baroque, don't fix it, right? So.
Yeah, exactly.
Oh, you did it. Okay.
Yeah, he threw it out there. It was almost like he threw me the basketball, and I just had to alley-oop it in. Have you heard of singthehours.com? Paul Rose, a young guy who has just recently, in the last couple of years, discovered Liturgy of the Hours, and he actually sings the Liturgy of the Hours, the morning and evening prayers from the breviary. And there are days, like a couple nights ago, He'll do certain days where he uses more Latin in the singing of it. He does a beautiful job. You probably appreciate it. We're going to have him on the program hopefully in the next few weeks as well.
Oh, that's good. That's good. I mean, I applaud any endeavors to help Catholics to realize that there are other forms of prayer besides the Mass. You know? I often say this, like, no, that's the highest form of prayer. That's not the only form of prayer, you know. And definitely the divine office or the breviary is something we need to see a lot more of.
Well, traditionsanity.substack.com is where people can find you there. We'll put links both on the screen as well as in the show notes, and then peterkwasniewski.com where people can find your books and things. We could keep obviously talking forever and ever, but we want to be cognizant of your time. Thank you so much once again for being on the program, being here with us, and just sharing this book, Treasuring the Goods of Marriage in a Throwaway Society. We'll put links to that as well. Thank you for being here.
You're welcome. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to talk.
Such great stuff. There are guests. Well, I tell you what, I feel like we're batting 1,000 lately with our guests. That I could keep talking beyond an hour with each one of these, but we get emails from you saying, I'm a little behind. We get that email about once. I'm a little behind listening to shows because there's so much content to take in. But thank you to all of you who are staying up to date with the program. You are our star pupils here at Adventures in Imperfect Living. And if you do fall behind, that's okay. You can always jump ahead or, play us at 1.75 speed to get caught up.
Well, in addition to feeling like I was sort of sitting through another history class, which I love, because you know me.
Why do you love history?
I just do, because it's true, many times filled with many goods and oftentimes imbued with examples of virtue that you can glean from our past, and also the abuse of virtue, which is also very much in our past, and how you can avoid that in our present. So we have much to learn from history, and I wish I had a greater love of that subject when I was in middle school and in high school, to be honest with you. But, I'm a student for the rest of my life. So I hope that all of our discussions were just as equally interesting to you as it was to us.
I always liked 20th century history. I like modern history. So when I was in high school, I really was fascinated by Vietnam era and, things that were happening like when I was born, but I didn't know about. But then I started to become really entranced by. I was interested in the Korean War. I remember in 5th or 6th grade going and seeing a movie called Incheon, which is it was a story about the Korean War. Always fascinated by those things. The thing that was always missing, and what I love about what Peter Kwasniewski does, is he brings in a philosophical angle. The discussion of why these things mattered and what they were doing to the greater society, how we should be thinking about them. A philosophical back, and this was a question I actually kind of wanted to bring up. I wish that I had a better philosophical foundation in my education. That's why I'm glad that our daughter's getting what she's getting right now. The classical curriculum, you see so much value in it now, but that was never really offered to us. The idea of thinking through these things and asking questions in a particular way and seeing the value of things as we. I think that's why I enjoy so many of our guests, like Dr. K. That our son Ben, even in college, he had to take a theology class and a philosophy class, and he really struggled with them because he's a mechanical engineering student. But even in discussions with him, I could see a difference, that there's a different level of questioning in a good way that comes out of it. It's not questioning for the sake of bring down the patriarchal hierarchy and that kind of thing, but it's more of what is really true, good, and beautiful.
Yeah, he is definitely seeking wisdom, and that's what we want to see continue in our son's life and all of our children for that matter. And, speaking of education of children is something I wanted to talk a little bit more about, because that definitely comes up a lot in Dr. K's book, that is one of the fruits of married life, is in educating the children, which is something that I find such a noble profession. It's one of the highest things that we can do as married people. I think earlier we did talk lightly on this idea that marriage was somehow the second-rated option because we weren't in nobility per se as the first option. So it's like, well, I'm not a noble, I guess I'll get married, But the marriage is such a noble institution and sacrament of its own. And the teaching of children is a fruit of that. So even if you don't have, biological offspring in your marriage, or maybe it just hasn't occurred yet, being somehow connected to education is beautiful. And it's a natural sort of it sort of springs out from that marital union in a beautiful way. So I just love that there are many teachers that I've come to know who don't even have children in their home, but love educating children. And I think that that's how they can continue the fruit of their marriage. And even in the Kwasniewski household, they are still busy educating people with their gifts that they've been given by God.
And one of the things that we're trying to do as a part of Rosary Army, our apostolate, is to continue educating you in your faith and growing in your faith. And that's why we are working so diligently right now in the creation of Rosary Army's new School of Mary. You can go to schoolofmary.com and get on the waiting list of our upcoming community prayer and learning platform, where you're going to be able to take various courses on different things, to be able to join in on prayers and live prayers and give your prayer intentions out there, but truly to become part of a community of people that are trying to grow not only in holiness, but in their education and understanding of our beautiful Catholic faith. And so if that's something that would be of interest to you, our plan is to make it completely free. You go over to schoolofmary.com and get on the waiting list. And so you can be some of our first students in our efforts of furthering not only your education, but ours as well. We learn by teaching, and we learn by sharing, and we learn by diving into these things and hearing from you. You teach us so much, and thank you for your emails. If you want to send us any feedback, you can either send us emails at feedback@gregandjennifer.com, or if you want to record a video or an audio feedback, either one of those, you can pull out your phone, record a video of yourself. You can upload it, go over to our transfer page. You can go to rosaryarmy.wetransfer.com. You should be seeing a little thing on the screen right now showing you how to do it. It's super easy. You upload the file directly from your phone or your computer, and it will send it directly to us. We'll play it on a future show and respond directly to you and your beautiful voice and your beautiful face. Thank you for being here with us. As always, we so appreciate you choosing this podcast to listen to or to watch. If you're watching on YouTube, please make sure that you're hitting that subscribe button, the like, and leave a comment. Let us know that you're out there, what you thought about today's conversation. And also, if you are listening to this on your favorite podcasting platform, subscribe. Let other people know about the work that we're doing, both at rosaryarmy.com and with the Adventures in Imperfect Living podcast. And as always, we encourage you to pray your rosary every single day. If you're not doing it regularly, start today. Make that commitment. Go pray your rosary. Spend some time meditating on the life of Jesus Christ with his mom. She's going to draw you closer to him than you could ever imagine when you pray the rosary. And
do whatever it takes to be holy.
We'll talk to you again very soon. Go over to rosaryarmy.com for more resources. Get yourself a free rosary. Pray along with us. And we'll talk to you again in a few days. Thanks for being with us. God bless, folks.
Bye.